Okay, last week we looked at a period when there were reasonably good relations between James and the church, between church and state. By the end of 1592, though, some things transpired that would sort of again throw James into more conflict with the church. Part of this is probably due to the sort of waning influence of his chancellor, Maitland, who, in terms of policy, thought it was good policy for James to be on good terms with the church. At the end of 1592, there were plots brewing by some of the Catholic nobles, and, well, one of the plots was to land Spanish troops in Scotland. On the 27th of December 1592, Andrew Knox, who was a minister at Paisley, which is a town very close to Glasgow on the Clyde River, he arrested, I guess it was sort of a citizen's arrest, George Kerr, a lawyer, who was about to embark for Spain, and he was carrying with him letters from Jesuit priests and blanks. These blanks were blank letters signed and sealed by the Earls of Huntly, Angus, and Errol. And apparently the plan was that some other Jesuit priest was going to fill them in with all kinds of promises and representations once the blanks got to Spain. It transpired that there was a plan to land 30,000 Spanish troops in Scotland for the purpose partly of invading England and partly for restoring Roman Catholic worship in Scotland. And if perhaps beyond just restoring worship, perhaps also for overthrowing the reform altogether. Okay, so without waiting for James's orders, he was out of the capital at the time. Both the Privy Council and the ministers of Edinburgh met, and they to discuss what actions to take. And they both wrote to James to return quickly. When he did return, his reaction wasn't horror at this conspiracy that was going on, but rather he was peeved with the church for meeting without his direction. As if they were bound to sit still and suffer themselves to be spoiled of their lives, liberties, and religion, merely because he thought that these were in no danger, or because he chose to neglect his duty and gave himself up to idle and frivolous amusements. From that, I would have guessed he'd been off hunting at the time, but I think he was actually banqueting somewhere. So, okay, there was a deputation of barons and ministers, and James, in a tedious and formal harangue, blamed them for assembling without waiting for his call, pointed out the difference between the times of the Queen Regent when the country was under a sovereign, addicted to popery, and the present when they had a Protestant king, and upbraided the ministers in particular by saying they were not wont to assemble with such alacrity or in so great numbers at his call. In other words, they were more enthusiastic to meet when he didn't call them than when he did. Surprise, surprise. They replied that they had the authority of the Privy Council for their meeting and that it was not a fit time to stand upon forums when they saw his person, the church, and commonwealth brought into extreme jeopardy. So he was either finally convinced or finally allowed himself to appear to be convinced that there was a serious problem. He made some proclamations about it, and that was about as far as it went. One of the minor conspirators were executed, but all the rest conveniently escaped from prison at various times. And the Privy Council eventually offered what would amounted to a pardon with a few terms. However, the nobles, they didn't accept it, and later took up arms. But I think the air conditioning's on. Finally. We don't have such big things to complain about as the Church of Scotland in the 1590s, so we complain about the air conditioning. The church, not entirely happy with James's administration here for not taking this very seriously, did a little bit more. On somewhat questionable jurisdiction, the Synod of Fife. So Fife is this region of Scotland, north of the Firth of Forth, north of Edinburgh, and where St. Andrews is, and the grounds for them having jurisdiction were that those nobles had been students at St. Andrews once. So they excommunicated four of the nobles, the three I mentioned, and let's see. I think the other one might have been Hume, but I don't have that in my notes. Okay. But anyways, this infuriated James, and he had several sort of petty ways of trying to get back at the church. The Privy Council finally came up with an act of abolition that exiled the nobles unless they promised to behave. And in an age when the Catholic Church specifically allowed its members to pretend they were Protestants, as long as they were working to destroy the Reformation, the nobles' promises were, if any, would be widely discounted. But nevertheless, 3 of them refused the terms of the act, and they took up arms. So, late in 1594, James took to the field to suppress the rebellion. And this was after the Earl of Argyll had been defeated by several of the Catholic nobles in a battle. James took with him Andrew and James Melville. Now, I mean, this sort of thing may seem peculiar. Even though he's always irritated with the church, he took them along and 2 other ministers, apparently to have a witness as to his sincerity in repressing the rebellion. Okay, when his troops got tired of not being paid, he wavered. But James Melville, this Andrew Melville's nephew, returned quickly to Edinburgh and raised funds through the churches to pay the soldiers. And so Otto Scott characterized James's leadership of the army as James began to move like a fierce snail towards the north and the mighty earls of the Highlands. So he finally did end up burning a couple castles, and that was as far as James's military action went, which I'm sure suited him just fine. He, at his best, his actions against these guys were very half-hearted, and it would appear partly that he didn't consider them to be a serious threat. I don't know all the reasons, but okay. Let's see. Oh, in January of 1594, James and Anne gave birth to Prince Henry, but he didn't live long enough to succeed James. Right, James's younger son Charles was his successor. Okay, probably a fairly minor incident historically, but again one that sheds some light on church-state relations. Yes?
So did this Spanish conspiracy then dissipate once it was found out? It sort of just fizzled?
No, it actually comes up again more than once. It seems to just go on and on.
They never actually get around to mobilizing troops.
Not in Scotland, but in England sent their own armada against Spain and destroyed most of its navy in port. No, in fact, James is very, Charles later tries to marry the daughter of Philip II. This is now many years later. But, I don't know. James was always very half-hearted at this. He didn't, except for when he thought it was politically astute to act against this conspiracy. Okay, so I guess what I was getting to is there's a minor incident in 1595. The minister of St. Andrews, David Black, began a process against a guy named Balfour of Burley because he wouldn't give up the manse. Somehow this guy had gotten possession of the manse for the minister at St. Andrews. And Burley, being somewhat eager not to lose the suit, sort of start his own offensive, which was he accused David Black of reviling the late Queen in his sermons. So the king set up a committee. I call it a committee. It was made up of members of the Privy Council and some ministers that he got to act on this committee to hear this case against the minister. Now, keep in mind everything that's gone before. This is, definitely outside of, from the church's view, this is definitely outside of James's jurisdiction. From James's view, everything's within his jurisdiction. So this is another sort of attempt to go halfway and for him to interfere in the ecclesiastical government. So Black, he objected to being tried by the assembly, and our friend Andrew Melville knocked on the door while they were meeting and came in. and he got permission to speak. And he told His Majesty, this is from McCree, what had often rung in his ears, that though he was the King of Scotland, he was not the King of the Church in Scotland, and that there was no court assembled there which had a right to try the cause which they had brought before them. But if King James VI has any judicature or cause here, it should be to judge not the faithful servants of Jesus Christ, the King of the Church, but turning to Burleigh, this traitor who has committed diverse points of high treason against His Majesty's civil laws, by taking his peaceable subjects in the night out of their houses and resetting in his own house the king's rebels and forfeited enemies. So there was some further argument that went on from there, but basically James finally just sort of dismissed the whole thing. James never liked to argue with people who were angry. I don't know if he was scared it would break out in violence or what, but he never did like to. When somebody really got heated, he always tried to sort of defer the argument till later. Okay, in 1595, on the 3rd of October, Maitland, the Chancellor, died, and as I mentioned, he wasn't, I don't think, particularly personally sympathetic to the Church, but he had a very moderating influence on the king in terms of getting him to sort of pursue a moderate course with the Church. And interestingly, at his death, he was attended by the Melvilles and by Robert Bruce, the minister in Edinburgh, who were, he was supposedly repented of his sins at the end. And I think in general the Church was sort of favorably disposed, at least he had been sort of a very fair person in terms of influencing the king and fulfilling his duties as Chancellor. Okay, well, some of the nobles had been exiled and forfeited, the Catholic conspiring nobles. And in August 1596, it became clear that there was sort of a move afoot to allow them to return to Scotland. And at one meeting about this, Melville appeared, partly as a commissioner of the church, and the king wanted to know what he was doing there. And he told him, "Sir, I have a call from Christ and His church, who charge you and your estates in their name that you favor not their enemies, nor go about to make citizens of those who have traitorously sought to betray their country to the cruel Spaniard, to the overthrow of Christ's kingdom." The king immediately had Melville ejected. But the meeting that didn't reach any conclusion as to what to do. And shortly thereafter, James, finding that bringing back these nobles was very unpopular, he promised that he wouldn't allow them to return. But that was a lie. Shortly thereafter, he started working on it again, and the General Assembly again sent a commission to the king. And once they arrived, he immediately, James started accusing them of being seditious. And at that point, Andrew Melville gave his famous address, the one that we take the title of the class from, about the two kingdoms. And let's see, McCree says it's perhaps the most singular in point of freedom that ever saluted royal ears, or that ever proceeded from the mouth of a loyal subject. But I think this is important enough to read at length, a fairly lengthy quote, but this is after taking the king by the sleeve and calling him God's silly vassal. It says, "Sir, we will always humbly reverence your majesty in public, but since we have this occasion to be with your majesty in private, and since ye are brought in extreme danger both of your life and crown, and along with you the country and the church of God are like to go to wreck, for not telling you the truth and giving you faithful counsel, we must discharge our duty or else be traitors both to Christ and you. Therefore, sir, as the first times before I have told you, so now again I must tell you, there are two kings and two kingdoms in Scotland. There is Christ Jesus, the King of the Church, whose subject King James VI is, and of whose kingdom he is not a king, nor a lord, nor a head, but a member. Those whom Christ has called and commanded to watch over his church and govern his spiritual kingdom have sufficient power and authority from him to do this both jointly and severally, the which no Christian king or prince should control and discharge, but fortify and assist, Otherwise, they are not faithful subjects of Christ and members of His church. We will yield to you your place and give you all due obedience. But again I say, you are not the head of the church. You cannot give us that eternal life which even in this world we seek for, and you cannot deprive us of it. Permit us then freely to meet in the name of Christ and to attend to the interest of that church of which you are the chief member. Sir, when you were in your swaddling clothes, Christ Jesus reigned freely in this land in spite of all His enemies. His officers and ministers convened and assembled for the ruling and welfare of His church, which was ever for your welfare, defense and preservation, when these same enemies were seeking your destruction and cutting off. Their assemblies since that time continually have been terrible to these enemies and most terrible to you. And now when there is more than extreme necessity for the continuance and discharge of that duty, will you, drawn to your own destruction by a devilish and most pernicious counsel, begin to hinder and dishearten Christ's subjects and your most faithful subjects, dishearten Christ's servants and your most faithful subjects, quarreling them for their convening and the care they have of their duty to Christ and you, when you should rather commend and countenance them as the godly kings and emperors did. The wisdom of your counsel, which I call devilish, is this, that you must be served by all sorts of men to come to your purpose and grandeur, Jew and Gentile, Papist and Protestant. And because the Protestants and ministers of Scotland are overstrong and control the king, they must be weakened and brought low by stirring up a party against them. And the king, being equal and different, both shall be fain to flee to him. But, sir, if God's wisdom be the only true wisdom, this will prove mere and mad folly. His curse cannot but light upon it. In seeking of both, you shall lose both. Whereas in cleaving uprightly to God, His true servants would be your sure friends, and He would compel the rest counterfeitly and lyingly to give over themselves and serve you. Okay, so again, James's policy, or whatever you want to call it, to not argue with angry men, he didn't really reply to Melville. He just backed down for the moment. So, I think Melville draws out here something that I haven't talked too much about, and that is that there are obviously people who see it in their best interest to promote this Catholic, the Catholic Party, not just for reasons necessarily because they want the reform overthrown necessarily, but rather just to sort of politically weaken the reform, and he alludes to this in the end. Okay, well, things heat up from there. Let's see, that was August 1596. May have been September, I guess. Need to get the date there. But by a couple months later, 9th of November, the commission was told by the king that there could be no agreement between the church and himself unless they agreed to the following points. And here's what James wanted. He wanted the ministers, they should not discuss matters of state in their sermons. The General Assembly should not meet without his explicit command. That nothing the General Assembly did should be valid until he had ratified it, as he ratified acts of Parliament. And the church should not bother itself with any offense punishable by the criminal law. Now, these 4 points, if you think, first of all, he's telling the ministers that they shouldn't speak anything related to matters of state, and that would include things like James's personal behavior, that the General Assembly shouldn't meet without his command, and particularly that all of their General Assembly's acts were subject to James's ratifying them. That's him taking complete control over the church, as I see it. I suppose you could say this is still a way for him to take control of the church without directly reestablishing episcopacy. In other words, it would be him directly over the General Assembly or above the General Assembly. Okay, if there was any doubt as to what the king's intentions were, they were quickly dispelled. David Black, who we mentioned before, the ministers of St. Andrews, was summoned to appear before the Privy Council the next day, the 10th of November, to account for the contents of some of his sermons. The church galvanized itself and drew up a declinature. Okay, this is a document which denied that the Privy Council had any authority or jurisdiction in the matter. This was sent throughout the presbyteries, and over 300 ministers signed this declinature. Initially, Black had been told when he appeared that what they called him for was for was that he had offended the Queen of England with comments he'd made on her religious character. James told the commissioners he did not think much of that matter, in other words, remarks made about Elizabeth, only they should cause him appear and take some course for pacifying the English ambassador. But take heed that you do not decline the judicatory, for if you do, it will be worse than anything that has yet fallen out. So he, I don't know, as I read it, James is basically spoiling for a fight here, because he was trying to establish in a minor matter that he had this sort of authority over the church. So, in fact, the English ambassador said he was satisfied with some, I don't know, the Black made some sort of private explanation or perhaps an apology. Yes, Mike?
What gave him such courage this time to try to do something like that? Was the church weak in faith? Because, it appears he has a strange behavior. It seems like when people are angry, he doesn't want to get involved. But he's got to know that this is going to get people angry, so he sets himself up for this confrontation. It seems non-confrontational. He obviously got one up.
Yeah, James is a coward. I mean, that's, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't want to sort of spoil for a fight. It's just, I mean, he's definitely avoids physical violence if at all possible, or the possibility of physical violence. But he, I don't think it was that the church was weakened. I just actually think that what's happened is that Maitland's chancellor had been sort of very much a restraining influence on him, and with that influence gone, James is about 30 now. He really feels like he's sort of come into his own. In fact, what he did after Maitland died was instead of appointing another chancellor, he appointed a committee of 8 called the Octavians, and he called them, with tongue-in-cheek, said that he wouldn't have any more chancellors, that he would only have hangable advisors. In other words, he's really sort of taking, I think what we're finding is he's really kind of taking control of things himself and not listening to any good counsel, and I think that's really the reason here. I mean, he has counsel, clearly, it's just not good counsel. So, I mean, it appears that by this time he was actively searching for something or some way to establish more control over the church. What we'll see is that when this doesn't work out as well as he likes, that he's actually, in just a few weeks, there'll be this other incident that comes up that he's going to use to try to establish control over the church. But at the very least, he was trying to cow the church into ignoring his and his counselors' behavior. Speaking of which,
is he being faithful with Queen
Anne? Not that I know of. He still has his court favorites. So,
He's an adulterer.
Yeah, I guess it depends what the meaning of faithful is. But so, yeah, no, there was a period commented on that he and the Queen appeared to be friendlier than they had been around this time, but as you'll see, he still has his favorites, so no, I wouldn't call him, I wouldn't say he's being faithful to his wife. There was a letter, which, if I understand the footnote correctly, says it was given in the name of the minister of Kilquanbar, which, I'm guessing that this means it was a fictitious or anonymous letter, which fretted James exceedingly, says, "Had not the discipline of the kirk been more reverently and better executed than the civil policy was these years bygone, the country had been cast in a barbarous confusion. Sir, wise men would have your majesty to ponder that saying, 1 Timothy 3:5, if any man cannot rule his own house, how shall he care for the kirk of God? And wise men think and say that had the ministers winked and been silent at men's proceedings, and suffered you to run from time to time your intended course, the crown long ere now had not been on your head." So there is also this issue of the fact that James was ruling very poorly, with the ignoring the conspiracies and so on, and I found the letter interesting, and it basically points out that he has no business ruling over the church. He certainly doesn't meet the qualifications for elder. So, okay. Anyways, when the Privy Council had dismissed the charge against Black, they immediately came up with another one. Yep. What's that? Yeah, he was ignoring the conspiracy we discussed sort of earlier, which was this Catholic conspiracy to land like 30,000 Spanish troops in Scotland.
Well, that was his own doing, wasn't it? Probably.
Well, that is, yeah. There's some possibility that.
I'm sorry. Question should be reserved for the end.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. But let me get to it in just a few minutes. There is actually a tie into his family on that. Okay. They actually came up with some new crimes related to black sermons, and I haven't been able to find out what the outcome of that was. It kind of gets overtaken by events. But within a few more days, this is between the 9th and 13th of December, they passed 3 acts of council. One prohibited all, including ministers, from uttering privately or publicly, in sermons or in familiar conferences, any false or slanderous speeches to the reproach or contempt of His Majesty, His Council, proceedings, or progenitors, and from meddling with affairs of state, present, bygone, or to come, under the pain of death. So, furthermore, they commanded all magistrates and burghs and noblemen and gentlemen in country parishes to interrupt and imprison any preachers whom they should hear uttering such speeches from pulpits. And they threatened with the highest pains all those who should hear offenses of this kind committed without revealing them. Okay, so that was one act. Another one required that pastors or ministers, before they were paid, subscribe a bond in which they promised to submit to the judgment of the King and Privy Council when accused of seditious or treasonable doctrine. And also they made a proclamation that ordered the commissioners of the General Assembly to leave the capital and declared its powers to be unwarranted and illegal. So on the 15th, the commissioners did leave the capital. And a couple days later, there was I guess I would call it a tempest in a teapot, but there was an uprising. Let's see, I think I mentioned already these Octavians, the 8 men who ruled the treasury. Several of these were suspected of being papists, or probably almost definitely were. Okay, but they did operate the treasury in a reasonably efficient and prudent manner. Another party at court called the Cubiculars. These were the king's favorites, also known officially as gentlemen of the bedchamber. They weren't very happy because these Octavians weren't spending, they weren't getting the kind of perks and so on that they were expecting. So the Cubiculars wanted to get rid of the Octavians. They tried to do this by playing the church against the Octavians. So they spread rumors among the Octavians that friends of the church were engaged in assassination plots against the Octavians. And then they spread rumors among the church that the Octavians were responsible for trying to bring back these exiled nobles. They were responsible for the persecution or prosecution of black, and that they were influencing the king against the church, and that they were trying eventually to overthrow the reform. So we're taking advantage of all the sort of Spanish Spanish/Catholic conspiracies that have been going on, and just trying to foment trouble. And they were slightly successful. So on the morning of the 17th of December, they sent information to Robert Bruce that Huntley had actually returned, and that his friends and retainers were outside the Capitol waiting for orders to enter. Okay, and so in a very sort of well-planned out propaganda campaign, they did all this stuff leading up to that morning, and there was a church meeting, and they rushed in someone rushed in, presumably someone sent from the cubiculars, saying, "Fie, save yourselves, the papists are coming to massacre you." And on the street someone was yelling, "To arms, to arms." And back in the church, "The sword of the Lord and Gideon." So a panic ensued. People rushed into the streets, with arms, and but then nothing happened. I mean, some people went from one place to another. Within an hour, the whole thing was calm. There was no sign that anything had happened. Okay, but this event was blown way out of proportion, and the king used it to make sort of great political hay out of this so-called uprising. And we'll get start on that next week. So, plenty of time for questions and discussion this morning. Bob, did you want to raise that question about the... Yeah. What does it have to do with his family life? Well, it's hard to say. Okay, I see what you're saying. If he doesn't rule his own household, okay. Yeah, well, I guess for the king, his household might be thought to include the kingdom. May have been the tie-in. The tie between his family and... being a civil magistrate, right, doesn't qualify him by itself. I don't think it disqualifies him, but I guess that we could discuss that later. He clearly wasn't qualified by any measure. They could find.
The point is, he wanted to rule the church.
The point is, yeah,
he wanted the authority of an elder in the church.
He wanted a super elder. Yes, that's exactly right. He wanted the authority of a super elder, and he had no, by any stretch of the imagination, meet any of the requirements.
I did, I'm sorry.
Why he didn't have the...
No, well, I mean, he probably didn't. He probably was a coward. But you're not making the case very well.
Well, he was a homosexual.
Yeah.
That was pretty much...
I documented that.
Well, I thought we had documented that.
Well, I'd say, yeah, beyond any kind of reasonable doubt, yeah.
Well, he probably wasn't qualified in any way, shape, or manner. I'm not saying he was.
Right.
But just today, you mentioned that it was his personal life, and then you, for example, said landing 30,000 Catholics. I don't know.
Well,
I guess my problem here is you're not very clear. And this is not legislative justice class. You're not very clear in what you're saying.
okay. Well,
what kind of conclusion is someone supposed to draw? I could listen to them all over again on the internet.
Well, Rob, I apologize if I'm not very clear. I try, but I'm only so good at doing this. So, and if I'm happy to provide all the references you can. I'd be happy for you all to read it. And I've actually posted a lot of my sources on the internet, so I'd be happy to have you read along and just follow.
Is there any documentation or anything like that? What is the church thing about those computers? Did they have that was going on?
Yeah,
They were preaching against it?
Well, okay, I don't know too much about the preaching on the particular subject of the cubiculars. I think they knew generally what was going on, but they, actually when this final incident came, and they encouraged them to go out into the, got all these people out in the streets. The minister tried to stop this, saying, "Wait, these aren't our weapons." But at that point, no one was listening. So I think, the cubiculars weren't just, fomenting the church; they were fomenting the people of the church, with a lot of rumor and half-truths and so on. So.
Had the church, was James under disciplined by the church, or did they allow him to be a member in good standing through all of it?
No, I don't think he's been disciplined by the church at this point. So.
Wasn't that a serious mistake? I mean, isn't that clearly just the politics overcoming the responsibilities of the church for the souls of its members? I mean, shouldn't you have been excommunicated? Or at least put under discipline?
Probably.
That raises a larger question about what discipline is the church allowed to perform that's not excommunication.
Well, I guess just under discipline. I mean, just
What does that mean?
well, in the very, I mean, not off of the head discipline, but at least to as Paul said, to put him out of the fellowship and barring from the table, I suppose.
That is excommunication.
Well, yeah.
Well, but it would start with sort of a rebuke, and it would go to then an official rebuke, and then if he failed to repent, then it would finally go to excommunication. But having said that, I guess I think in general the Scottish Church still tended to, they certainly tended to treat the sovereign a lot different than they would treat anyone else. I mean, Andrew Melville's speech to him notwithstanding, that was quite a bold thing, and I mean, McCree says it was probably the boldest speech ever given. So, but I mean, I think to a certain extent you'll see this later when Charles is imprisoned and then finally executed. They didn't approve of his execution. They still had a fairly high, view of the sovereign, and it's one that we wouldn't hold today. Not.
I guess I see that our evangelical pastors, super pastors, treating. I mean, not so much.
Yeah.
They did the same thing with women.
Yeah.
And they said some hard things to him, or they claimed to have said some hard things to him. But basically, it was always clearly just turned by the administration for political means. And it seems like James is doing the same thing. He's willing to accept these hard things that these pastors come and say to him, but because there's never any peace to it, he just keeps turning for political advantage. And he can make hay out of everything. Political hay out of everything. And he's even willing to, to just say stuff that clearly he doesn't believe in order to press his cause a little further.
Yeah.
Well, who's got the responsibility to excommunicate? Like, there's only one body that really can do that.
Yeah,
The elders of his church.
Yeah.
Right.
But
So, that's where it begins and ends. That's the state of Christianity.
Yeah.
I guess, Dan, to sort of answer your question, I guess we'd probably have to sort of pick a specific thing that he should be excommunicated for. I guess, someone could hold, certainly could hold views that weren't the same as the church without it being an excommunicatable offense. Now, in his case, the views also coincide with his jurisdiction, so that, I think there probably are things, but I don't have, there's not one that comes to mind, and he tended to couch his speech.
Because he was so
Yeah, partly. That's partly it. Yeah, Mike.
Does anybody know when the Baptists at their convention certified that the time of church discipline failed? Okay. What was the reasoning there? And the probably tell us what was the Bible. Do they just, is there a logic or a principle here where the church cannot take and with their leaders of the churches?
I think I probably should demur from answering the question, but I would be willing to give you my understanding if no one else will jump in and answer the question. Right, I think it's actually means, okay, it's a Baptist church, right? So it's an association of churches. So if his elders won't discipline them, there's very little the rest of the denomination can actually do. They could, I suppose, if it came to it, throw his church out of their association. But
well, they could put out a censor of some sort of thing. That he did not represent the main lines and something.
I don't know. You're beyond me as to whether or not that would actually be within their sort of constitutional bounds or not. So.
You'd have to say, though, if you look at it, there was no ignorance of our ministers. You couldn't say they were ignorant of what he did sense that he was not perpetuating. They knew about it, but they didn't have
Yeah, it's hard to say. Really, I mean, there is such a thing as common rumor, and then actually knowing for sure if something's true or not. I really don't know, Mike. That's a good question. I would think it would be, the sins as they were would be fairly well known, and for that he should have been excommunicated. But sometimes people also maybe they may have chosen to since it's mostly rumor, they may have chosen to ignore rumor. I don't know.
Or maybe they can call up their WWWJD bracelet and say, let's just
well, maybe. Well, by virtue of contributing that last noteworthy comment, Mike, why don't you close in prayer?